I found the diary last winter, buried under a stack of boxes in a closet I hadn't opened in years. The leather cover was cracked, the edges worn, the pages swollen from the kind of tears you don't forget. I froze the moment I touched it. I didn't plan to read it again. In fact, I spent most of my adult life pretending it didn't exist. Because inside those pages was the version of me I tried so hard to bury. For a long time, I lived a life that looked perfect from the outside. A smiling wife, a faithful woman. The kind of person people pointed at and said, she has it all figured out. But inside I was slowly dissolving. Not suddenly, not dramatically. But in the quiet way a candle dies out when no one is watching. When I picked up the diary that night, my hands were shaking. I wasn't afraid of what I had written. I was afraid of remembering who I used to be, before I learned to stay silent, before I learned to smile when I wanted to scream, before I learned that being a good wife often meant disappearing a little more each day. I sat on the floor, the cold from the tiles seeping into my skin, and opened the first page, and there it was. My handwriting, younger, softer, hopeful, almost naive. The very first sentence felt like a knife. I don't know who to tell, so I guess I'll tell these pages. I closed my eyes. Because I remember that girl. I remember the loneliness she carried while pretending to be strong. I remember the weight of expectations. And I remember the moment she realized she wasn't allowed to question anything, not faith, not marriage, not tradition, not even her own pain. But as I turned the pages, slowly, carefully, like touching something sacred, I also realized something else. This diary wasn't just a memory, it was the map of how I lost myself. And how I would eventually find my way back. And that's where my story truly begins. I kept reading, even though every part of me wanted to close the diary and shove it back into the box where I found it. But something inside me whispered, keep going. Don't run this time. The next few pages weren't dramatic. They weren't filled with secrets or revelations. They were just sad, quietly sad. I wrote about being 17. About trying so hard to be pure, obedient, worthy. About praying every night for God to make me better. Because I was convinced something in me was broken. Something the other girls didn't seem to struggle with. There was a line one underlined 3 times. A line that felt like it belonged to a stranger, even though it came from my own hand. I want to be good, but being good feels like disappearing. I swallowed hard when I read that. Because I remember exactly when I wrote it. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, back in my childhood home, the house that always smelled like laundry soap and fear of disappointing people. I remember hearing my parents in the kitchen discussing scriptures. I remember feeling like there was no space in that house for my doubts, or my questions, or my confusion. Back then, I thought everyone else was confident. Everyone else believed without hesitation. Everyone else seemed to know their place. I envied them, desperately. I thought their certainty was a reward for being stronger, or more faithful, or more righteous than me. But reading those pages now with years of distance, I know the truth. Most of us were just pretending to be sure, pretending to be whole, pretending that the fear inside us was the spirit and not anxiety, pretending because pretending was safer than being honest. And I became very good at pretending. I turned the page again. Another entry. This one written the night before my wedding. The handwriting rushed, uneven, like the pen was shaking. Everyone says I'm lucky. Everyone says he's perfect for me. Everyone says this is God's plan. But why do I feel like I'm walking into a life I didn't choose? I closed the diary for a moment. My breath caught in my throat. Because that line, that quiet confession, was the first time I ever admitted to myself that something felt wrong. Not sinful, not rebellious. Just wrong. And I buried it. I buried it because everyone around me seemed so certain. Because doubt, for a woman like me, was a kind of betrayal. Because questioning meant risking everything. Family, community, belonging, identity. I opened the diary again. The next page was stained, a darker spot on the corner, one I never questioned back then. Now I recognize it for what it was, a tear I didn't want to admit I had cried. Reading my own words from that time felt like watching a younger version of myself drowning quietly while the world clapped from the shore, cheering, celebrating, never noticing how my hands were barely above the water. And the truth is, I didn't even know how to call for help. Because I didn't have a language for my pain yet, only silence. Silence was the only thing that felt acceptable. Silence was how you earned approval. Silence was how you avoided conflict. Silence was how you stayed worthy. But silence was also how I started to disappear from myself. As I kept reading, another realization hit me, slowly, painfully. This diary wasn't only a record of my thoughts. It was a timeline of a woman learning to suppress her own voice. A map of every moment I convinced myself that my feelings were unimportant, inconvenient, or dangerous. And yet, here I was, decades later, holding the evidence that my voice existed long before I learned to bury it. For the first time in years, I whispered, not a prayer, not a plea, not a confession, but a truth I wish someone had told that girl back then. You were never broken. You were just unheard. The room felt different after that. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt honest. I turned the page again, ready to face the next version of me waiting there. Ready, for the first time in my life, to listen without fear. And that's when the story deepens. The part where I begin to understand how a girl who only wanted to be good slowly became a woman who forgot she was allowed to exist. The next entry was written months after the wedding, yet it carried the same tone of uncertainty as the one before it. I hadn't realized until now that the hesitation followed me like a shadow long before I ever said, I do. It wasn't about him. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the kind of man who broke things when he was angry. No, it was the structure around us, the unspoken rules I absorbed like air, the expectations wrapped around my shoulders like a cloak I could never take off. As I kept reading, I found more of the girl I used to be, soft, hopeful, afraid of being the wrong kind of woman. There's an entry from when I was 15. The ink is lighter, the handwriting almost childish. I want to be good. I want God to be proud of me. I want people to see me the way they see the other girls. I remember that version of me. The girl who woke up at dawn to read scriptures, not because she loved them, but because she thought God would love her more if she tried harder. The girl who fasted longer than she should have, thinking discomfort was proof of devotion. The girl who never allowed herself to feel anger, because anger meant imperfection. A girl who didn't know the difference between faith and fear, because no one ever taught her. I turned the page again. A longer entry, the tone darker. Sometimes I think everyone else was born knowing how to belong. I feel like I'm always pretending, like I'm always one mistake away from disappointing everyone. I don't know why God would make me so unsure. My throat tightened. Back then, I believed uncertainty was a spiritual flaw, something shameful, something only I struggle with. I didn't know the other girls were lying too. I didn't know most of us were terrified of not being enough. I didn't know that inside our tidy houses and quiet halls, women carried guilt like it was a second skin, but I thought I was alone. Loneliness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's polite. Sometimes it's quiet enough to be mistaken for obedience. I kept reading. There was an entry from my 16th birthday. I remember that day vividly. A small celebration, a homemade cake, the hymn my mother insisted we sing before cutting it. The diary described it differently than my memory, with a line that stopped me. I smiled the whole time. I'm getting better at hiding it. Hiding what? I asked myself, even though I already knew the answer. Hiding the ache. Hiding the sense that something in me didn't fit inside the shape everyone expected me to fill. Hiding the growing fear that if anyone ever truly saw me, all the confusion, the longing, the questions, they would call it weakness, or worse, rebellion. So I smiled. And everyone praised me for being good. I didn't realize that every compliment was just another brick in the cage I was building around myself. The diary entries from that period were filled with phrases like, I hope I'm doing it right. I don't want to disappoint them. Maybe if I pray harder, the doubts will go away. It hurts now, reading those lines as an adult. A woman who finally understands she wasn't wrong for feeling what she felt. She was just young, and scared, and craving guidance she never received. As I turned another page, I found a small envelope taped inside. I hesitated before opening it. The paper was thin, delicate, and had yellowed around the edges. Inside was a folded note, one I had forgotten existed. It was written by my mother. Her handwriting was elegant, every letter perfectly shaped. I remembered how she prided herself on her penmanship, how she believed it reflected her character. Her message was short. Always remember, a good woman brings peace, not questions. I stared at the note for a long time. Peace, not questions. Obedience, not curiosity. Silence, not truth. Those were the lessons I grew up with. Not because anyone wanted to hurt me, but because generation after generation had been taught the same thing and passed it down like a sacred inheritance. I slid the note back into the envelope. Reading it now, I could finally see what I couldn't back then. I wasn't raised to understand myself. I was raised to erase myself, not out of malice, but out of tradition. And tradition, when unquestioned, can become a quiet kind of prison. The diary pages from that time felt like a slow descent into a version of me that was always trying to shrink, to soften, to disappear just enough to fit inside expectations. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even noticeable to the people around me. It was gentle, and that was the danger. Gentle erasure, soft obedience, silent suffering dressed as righteousness. By the time I reached adulthood, I didn't even realize how much of myself I had already traded away. And as I sat there on the cold floor with the diary in my hands, one thought formed, heavy, honest, impossible to ignore. This is where it started. The unraveling. The disappearance. The slow separation between who I really was and who I was told to be. But I didn't close the diary. Because if this was where the silence began, then maybe this was also where I could begin to break it. The next section of the diary was written during the months leading up to my engagement, though I didn't know it at the time. I wasn't writing about him. I was writing about myself, or more accurately, the pieces of myself I was already starting to let go. I turned to an entry dated early spring. I could almost smell the old paper as I read it, the faint trace of perfume I used to wear when I was trying to feel older, more confident, more acceptable. Everyone keeps saying I'm ready, the entry began. Ready for responsibility, ready for adulthood, ready for marriage. I don't feel ready for anything. But maybe readiness isn't about feelings, maybe it's about obedience. I remember that spring. The thaw after winter. The way snow melted into the ground like forgotten promises. I remember trying to convince myself that the knot in my stomach was normal, that all women felt this way. That uncertainty was just part of the process of becoming what everyone said I should be. There's another line on that page, written more harshly, the pen pressing deep into the paper. I think my life is being decided for me, and I don't know how to stop it without disappointing everyone. I stopped reading for a moment, because that line, more than any other, was the beginning of the version of me who learned to disappear for the sake of keeping the peace. Not because anyone forced me. Not because anyone threatened me. But because I had been taught since childhood that a good woman doesn't disrupt the harmony. A good woman doesn't say no. A good woman doesn't question timing or choice or desire. A good woman accepts and adapts and smiles, even when her heart is trembling. As I sat there with the diary open on my lap, I could feel the weight of that truth pressing on my chest. The kind of pressure that doesn't suffocate you all at once, but slowly, steadily over years. I turned another page. This entry was shorter. I don't know what I want. I only know what I'm supposed to want. My voice cracked when I whispered the words aloud. Because that line wasn't just written by a younger version of me. It was written by a girl who had never been allowed to imagine a life outside the one she was born into. A girl who believed that desire was dangerous if it didn't match expectation. A girl who mistook compliance for spirituality. I kept reading. Another entry. This one from a Sunday afternoon, after a lesson in church about the roles of women. I remember that day vividly. The way I sat in the pew, hands folded, back straight, trying to appear composed while something inside me twisted uncomfortably. The diary captured it in a single heartbreaking paragraph. They say a righteous woman is gentle, quiet, supportive, patient, graceful under pressure, but I don't feel graceful. I feel trapped between who I am and who they want me to be. And I'm scared that if anyone ever knew the truth, they would call me weak, or selfish, or faithless. My fingers trembled slightly as I traced the words. Weak, selfish, faithless. Those were the fears that shaped my entire young adulthood. Not fear of sin. Not fear of failure. But fear of being seen as anything less than the perfect woman the community expected. A woman who never doubted, never questioned, never faltered, never cracked. A woman who didn't exist. And yet, I spent years trying to become her. As I turned another page, I found a longer entry, one written late at night, judging by the slant of the handwriting. Sometimes I wonder what my life would look like if I chose for myself. But then I feel guilty for even imagining it. God wouldn't put desires in my heart that weren't righteous. Right? So if I want something different, something bigger, something with my own voice in it, then maybe that means the problem is me. I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I didn't bother to wipe it. Because I finally understood something I couldn't see back then. I spent so many years believing my internal voice was sinful that I never learned to hear it properly. The diary entries grew more serious after that. Not dramatic, but heavy. A slow shift, a darkening of tone, a quiet unraveling. In one entry I wrote, I don't know how to trust myself, and that was the truth, the deepest truth, the most painful truth. How can you trust your own instincts when you've been trained since childhood to mistrust your own thoughts? How can you choose your own path when you've been raised to believe your purpose has already been chosen for you? How can you exist as a whole person when you've been taught that self-sacrifice is the highest form of righteousness? I turned another page. Another line struck me like a blow. I wish someone would ask me what I really feel. But I don't think anyone wants the real answer. That sentence broke something in me. Because I remember feeling invisible not because others ignored me, but because I hid myself so deeply that no one even knew where to look. And even if they did, I wouldn't have known how to speak. Silence was easier. Silence was safer. Silence was praised. But silence was also killing me, one unspoken thought at a time. I closed the diary for a moment, pressing it against my chest, as if I could embrace the younger version of myself trapped inside those pages. If I could speak to her now, I would say, "You're not lost, you're not wrong. You're not alone." But she didn't have those words back then. She only had silence. And that silence is the thread that would follow her, follow me, into marriage, into adulthood, into every quiet moment when I wondered why my heart felt so heavy in a life that was supposed to be joyful. I opened the diary again. Because I wasn't ready to stop. Not anymore. This was the beginning of the unraveling, but it was also, somehow, the beginning of understanding. And I needed to know where the next page would lead. The next entry was dated just a few weeks before my wedding. The ink looked darker, newer, as if the words had been written with more force than usual. I remembered that period, the congratulations, the smiles, the endless comments about how everything was falling into place. But reading the diary now, I realized that nothing was falling into place. I was falling into silence. Everyone keeps telling me this is the right time, the entry began. But I don't feel ready. I feel like I'm stepping into a life that was prepared for me long before I ever knew myself. I paused. Let the words sink in, because marriage wasn't a choice for me, not really. It was a destination, a checkpoint, a duty wrapped in celebration. And the girl I used to be believed that love was less important than approval, less important than obedience, less important than fitting the mold perfectly, without cracks or questions. I turned the page. This entry was written the night before the wedding. My handwriting was frantic, the lines slanted, the ink smudged. I should be excited. Everyone keeps asking if I'm excited. I smile and say yes. But inside I feel like I'm leaving myself behind in this bedroom. Like tomorrow I will wake up and become someone else. Someone I'm supposed to be. Someone better. My stomach tightened. I remember that night. The silence in my room felt heavy, almost sacred. The weight of expectation pressed against my ribs. I remember sitting in bed, trying to pray, trying to feel peace, trying to convince myself that the tremor in my chest was just nerves, not warning, not truth. And I remember telling myself, doubt is selfish, stop thinking. Just do what's right. But right never felt like mine, it felt inherited. I turned to the next entry, the first one written as a married woman. Today, everyone said I looked beautiful. I tried to believe them. I tried to feel the joy they said I should feel. I tried to be present. But the whole time I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body, wondering when I would start to feel like the woman everyone expected me to be. I swallowed hard as I read it. Dissociation. I didn't have that word back then. I just thought I was failing at being happy. The diary described the wedding in simple terms, nothing poetic, nothing romantic. Just observations. The flowers were perfect. The music was perfect. The guests smiled at me like I was stepping into a holy calling. And I stood there, smiling back, trying not to think about the quiet panic inside me. There was one line that made my hands tremble. I'm married now. I thought I would feel different. I don't. A simple sentence. But heavy, painful, honest. I remembered the moment I wrote it. Late at night, sitting on the edge of a bed that didn't feel like mine, wearing a nightgown someone else chose for me as a bridal gift. Everything felt foreign, even my own skin. I kept reading. One of the next entries was longer, written during the first month of marriage. He keeps asking if I'm okay. I keep saying yes. I don't know how to explain the emptiness without hurting him. I don't want to hurt him. He's kind. He tries. But I feel like I'm performing something I don't understand. I paused. Closed my eyes because it wasn't about him. And it never was. It was about the structure, the expectations, the belief that a woman's worth was measured by how seamlessly she could fold herself into the role assigned to her. I learned to fold myself well. Too well. The entries grew darker after that. Not in drama but in subtlety. A slow suffocation. A shrinking of self so gentle that no one, not even I, noticed how small I became. There was a page where I wrote, I miss the version of me I haven't met yet. At the time, I didn't understand what that meant. Now I do. I miss the woman I was supposed to become, if only I had been allowed to hear myself, to trust myself, to choose for myself. But at 20, I didn't know that. I only knew that people were proud of me. That I was doing everything right. That I was living the life I had been raised to live. And praise is a powerful drug, especially for a girl who grew up believing approval was the highest form of love. I turned the page, another entry. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and feel like I'm dying quietly, not my body, my soul. But I don't know how to tell anyone. I don't think they would understand. That line hit me like a cold wave. Because that was the first moment I admitted, even in secret, that something inside me was breaking. Not a dramatic break, not a loud break. Just the slow, painful cracking of a woman trying to hold herself together for the sake of everyone else. The next entry was only one sentence. I'm disappearing. And no one sees it, not even me. I pressed the diary against my chest as if I could hold that younger version of myself. If someone had asked me back then, "Are you happy?" I would have smiled and said yes. Because I didn't know I was allowed to say anything else. Because I didn't know unhappiness was something that could be spoken, not hidden. Because I didn't know silence was not the same thing as peace. And I didn't know that losing yourself can happen even in a quiet house, with gentle people and a husband who does nothing wrong. Because it's not always the people. Sometimes it's the system, the expectations, the mold, and some women break loudly. But others, women like me, break softly. So softly that no one hears, not even themselves. I turned the page again. And that's when the darkest section of the diary began, the part where I stopped describing moments and started describing feelings I didn't have the courage to say aloud. The part where the silence became unbearable. The next pages felt different the moment I touched them. The ink was darker. The handwriting sharper, almost carved into the paper. The words looked like they were written by someone cornered inside her own life. I knew this part, even before reading it. I remembered the feeling of those days, not the events, but the heaviness, the quiet dread that followed me from room to room. I turned to the first entry of what I now call the dark season. I think something inside me is fading. Not quickly, slowly, quietly, like a light running out of oil. That line alone pulled a deep ache from my chest. Back then, I didn't understand depression. I didn't have the language for emotional collapse. All I had was silence and the belief that pain meant I was failing spiritually. I kept reading. He asks why I'm tired all the time. I don't know how to answer. How do you explain exhaustion that doesn't come from the body, but from being someone you're not? My breath tangled in my throat. Because I remember waking up every morning with a heaviness that wasn't physical. The kind of heaviness you don't rest away. A weight that comes from living a life that doesn't fit your soul. The diary continued. I pray, but the prayers feel empty. I write scriptures, but the words don't reach me. Everyone thinks I'm strong. Everyone thinks I'm faithful. No one knows that I cry in the bathroom, so he won't hear. I close my eyes for a moment. Those tears, I had forgotten some of them. But my body remembered. A tightness, a burning behind the ribs, a trembling that never went away. I turned the page. Another short entry. I'm trying to be the woman they want me to be. I'm trying so hard. But the more I try, the less of me remains. I felt a deep sadness reading that sentence, the sadness of a woman erasing herself piece by piece because she believed self-sacrifice was holy. But the entry that followed was the one I dreaded most. I knew it was coming. I remembered writing it, not where I was or what I was wearing, but the exact emotional collapse behind the words. It was only a single line. I think I'm disappearing, not dying, not running, not breaking, disappearing. And that's what it felt like. Like the person I was, or could have been, was dissolving silently while life went on around me. I turned the page, and the handwriting changed again, smaller, more controlled. Like I was trying to hide even from myself. People at church say I'm glowing with happiness. I want to tell them it's not a glow. It's the last of my strength burning out. I remember that too. The compliments, the assumptions, the way people praised my composure as if it were evidence of spiritual success, not emotional survival. The diary continued. I used to have dreams, little ones, soft ones. But I can't remember them anymore. All I remember is the checklist of who I'm supposed to be. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. Dreams are often the first thing to die when a woman loses her voice. I turned another page. This one was the hardest to read. It began slowly. I thought marriage would feel like a home I could grow in, then darker. But instead, it feels like a room with no doors. Then darker still. I keep thinking, maybe this is what I was made for, to endure, not to live. I paused. Because this was the deepest wound of all. The belief that suffering was my purpose. That endurance was my identity. That quietness was my destiny. I took a deep breath and kept reading. The next entry was written late at night, the ink uneven. Sometimes I wonder who I would be if I could choose for myself, but then I feel guilty. Choice feels dangerous, like betrayal, and then the line I feared most. I don't know how to exist without permission. My throat closed. Because that wasn't just a sentence. It was the truth about who I had become. A woman so conditioned to obedience that she didn't know how to breathe on her own. I turned to the next page. And there it was, the moment everything shifted. The first forbidden thought I ever wrote. What if the life I'm living isn't the life I was meant for? Simple, soft, almost innocent. But in my world, at that time, those words were dangerous, rebellious, unthinkable. A woman wasn't supposed to ask that. A Mormon wife wasn't supposed to question that. I wasn't supposed to imagine a life beyond my prescribed role. But I wrote it, trembling, crying, afraid, because somewhere inside me, beneath the silence, beneath the obedience, beneath the disappearance, a small voice was trying to survive. A voice I had buried for years, a voice that refused to stay dead. A voice that whispered, "There is more than this," and that whisper, that single fragile whisper, would become the beginning of everything that came after. After that forbidden sentence, that quiet, trembling line wondering if I was meant for a different life, the tone of the diary changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a slow, painful shift I could feel through every page. It was as if my younger self had cracked open a door she wasn't supposed to touch, and the light that slipped through terrified her. The next entry was written several days later. I've been trying to pretend that nothing has changed, but something inside me feels awake, not fully, just barely. Like a single ember glowing under ashes. I felt my heart tighten. Because that ember, that small spark, was the beginning of the end of my silence. Not because I wanted rebellion, not because I wanted to leave, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because something deep inside me realized it could no longer endure being invisible. I turned the page. This entry was longer, written late at night. I could almost hear my younger self's breath shaking as she wrote it. Today he asked why I seemed distracted. I lied. I said I was tired. But the truth is, I'm afraid of what I'm feeling. I'm afraid of wanting something I can't name. I paused. That line stayed with me for years. The fear of wanting something broader, freer, truer than the life I had. Back then, desire wasn't allowed to be vague. It had to fit a shape, a doctrine, a role, a destiny. Anything outside that was forbidden, even if it was just longing for air. I turned to the next page. The handwriting was shakier than usual. I tried to pray the desire away. I begged God to take it. I told him I didn't want to feel things I wasn't supposed to feel. But the harder I prayed, the louder the ache became. I remember that ache. It lived behind my ribs. It pulsed beneath every smile. It followed me to church, to bed, to family dinners, to quiet mornings when I washed dishes and wondered why my life felt like something happening to someone else. The entry continued. I feel guilty every moment of the day. I feel guilty for the doubt, guilty for the longing, guilty for the emptiness, guilty for not being enough, guilty for being too much, guilty for wanting to breathe. I whispered the last sentence aloud, wanting to breathe, something so simple, something so human, something so forbidden in the life I was taught to live. I turned the page. This was the entry where everything broke open. The moment I reached my emotional limit. The handwriting wasn't neat, not even controlled. The lines were jagged, uneven, like the hand of someone holding back sobs. I locked myself in the bathroom today. Not because anything happened. Not because someone yelled. Not because I was hurt. But because I couldn't pretend for one more minute. My chest ached as I kept reading. I sat on the floor and stared at the tiles. I don't know how long I was there. I just remember feeling like my soul was trying to claw its way out of me. I could almost see it. The cold tiles, the silence, the way the house hummed faintly with life outside the door while I sat inside unraveling quietly. I pressed my hand over my mouth so I wouldn't cry loud enough for him to hear. I didn't want him to think he failed. He didn't. He just doesn't know that I'm dying from a life that isn't mine. That line was a knife. Not because of the pain, but because of the honesty. I continued reading. When I finally opened my eyes, I realized something that terrified me. Not that I was unhappy, not that I felt lost, not even that I wanted something different. And then the line that marked the exact moment of rupture. I realized I don't know who I am. Not even a little. I closed my eyes. Because that moment, that quiet moment on a bathroom floor, was the beginning of everything that came after. The diary went on. I've spent so long trying to be what everyone needed me to be that I forgot I was supposed to be someone at all. I don't know my own voice. I don't know my own desires. I don't know my own thoughts unless they've been filtered through what is acceptable. I swallowed hard. Because losing yourself isn't sudden. It's slow, incremental, gentle. I'm afraid, the entry continued, not of sin, not of punishment, not of judgment. I'm afraid that if I let myself feel anything, everything will fall apart. That was the truth, not fear of leaving. Not fear of rebellion, but fear of honesty, because honesty meant confronting a lifetime of silence. The last sentence of the entry was almost illegible, the ink smudged by tears. I don't want to disappear anymore. I ran my fingers over the words, feeling the indent left by the pressure of the pen. That was the exact moment my younger self broke. Not outwardly, not publicly, not loudly. She broke in the quietest place a woman can break, inside her own mind. And from that breaking, a new voice, faint, trembling, but alive, began to rise. After the night on the bathroom floor, there was a gap in the diary. Maybe weeks. The pages jumped from one emotional collapse straight into a strange calmness, as if the storm inside me had exhausted itself and left behind an unbearable stillness. The next entry was shorter. I feel empty. Not in a dramatic way, just hollow. Like my body is moving through the world, but I'm somewhere far behind it. I knew that feeling. A quiet detachment. A numbness that wasn't rest but surrender. But then, unexpectedly, the tone of the diary shifted. It started with a single surprising sentence. Today, someone noticed me. I read it twice, my chest tightening, because I remembered how shocking that moment had felt. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't rebellious. It wasn't even intimate. It was simple, human. The entry continued. It happened at the grocery store. I was standing in the bread aisle, staring at the shelves, unable to remember what I came to buy. A woman asked if I was okay. Just that. A stranger's voice, soft, unassuming, concerned in the simplest way. I said yes, automatically, but something in her expression made me stop. She looked at me like she saw something I didn't mean to show. I remembered that moment. The fluorescent lights, the hum of the refrigerators, the weight of a grocery basket in my hand. And a stranger, a woman I had never seen before, looking into my eyes with a kind of gentle honesty that cut through my silence. The diary went on. She didn't push, she didn't pry. She just said, "You look tired, really tired. I hope you're taking care of yourself." And then she walked away. That was it. Just a sentence spoken by a stranger. But sometimes the smallest kindness is the most disarming, especially when you've spent years being invisible. I remember standing there long after she left, frozen by the shock of it. Someone had seen me, not my role, not my worthiness, not my obedience, me. It was such a simple thing, the entry continued. But I felt something inside me shift. Like a small crack opening in a wall I didn't know I built. I pressed my fingers lightly against the page. Because this part, this tiny fragile moment, was when the silence inside me loosened for the first time. Not broken, not shattered, just loosened. The diary went deeper. For the rest of the day I kept thinking about her words. No one in my life asks if I'm okay. They ask if I'm righteous, obedient, patient, but not okay. I closed my eyes. The honesty in that hurt more than the darker entries. Because sometimes the deepest pain isn't the suffering itself, but the realization that no one ever asked about it. I didn't know what taking care of myself meant, I had written. I still don't. But for the first time, the thought didn't feel sinful. That was the revelation. Not a rebellion. not a decision. Just a thought. Maybe caring for myself wasn't wrong. I turned the page. The next entry had a different energy, still sad, still heavy, but softer around the edges. I took a walk today, alone, just around the block. It felt strange, like inhabiting my body for the first time in years. I remembered that walk vividly. The air was cold, the sun was pale, the world was ordinary. But my breathing felt different, slower, deeper, mine. I didn't go far, the entry continued. But each step felt like a sentence in a language I was learning for the first time. That line made my chest tighten. Because self-awareness often begins exactly like that, not with epiphanies or dramatic declarations, but with a quiet step in the direction of yourself. As I continued reading, the entries reflected that slow shift. I sat on the porch today and listened to the wind. I realized I haven't been outside alone in months. It scares me how foreign stillness feels when it belongs to me. And then, the line that marked the turning point. Maybe God doesn't want me to disappear. I felt tears gathering in my eyes. Because that was the first time I saw myself treat hope as something allowed, not forbidden. The diary ended the entry with, I don't know where this leads. I don't even know what I'm hoping for. I just know that something inside me is waking up. Slowly, carefully, quietly, like it's afraid to be seen, but wants to be. I closed the diary for a moment and placed my hand over the cover. This was where my story began to change. Not because someone saved me, not because I made a bold choice, not because life forced me into transformation, but because for the first time in years, I felt seen. And being seen made me want to see myself, even if just a little, even if just in small trembling steps. And that small shift, that tiny spark, would eventually become the beginning of reclaiming the life I lost. The next pages of the diary felt different the moment I touched them, lighter somehow. Not happy, not even close, but something had shifted. A subtle warmth beneath the ink, like a candle flickering in a dark room. I turned to the first entry of this new section. I woke up today, and the world didn't feel as heavy. I don't know why. Nothing has changed, but I felt present, even for a moment. Presence, such a simple word. But back then, it felt like a miracle. For years, I had been living on autopilot, doing what I was told, being who I was expected to be, moving through life like a ghost wearing a wife's body. Feeling present, even for a breath, felt like borrowing air from another world. The diary continued, I made myself tea this morning just for me. Not for anyone else. I sat by the window and watched the light move across the floor. I didn't think about what I should be doing. It felt strange, but peaceful. I smiled softly as I read that. Tea. Just tea. But in those days, choosing something for myself felt like rebellion in its purest form. I turned the page. Another entry, short but meaningful. I forgot how it feels to enjoy silence, my own silence. Not the heavy, suffocating kind I've lived with, but the quiet that comes from being alone with myself without fear. I ran my fingers over those words. Because that shift, from suffocating silence to restorative silence, is the moment a woman begins to return to herself. The next entry was longer. I went for another walk today. The air was cold, but it made me feel awake. I kept noticing small things I forgot how to notice. The sound of leaves, the distant laughter of children, the way the wind moves through branches. I didn't realize how numb I'd been. I remembered that walk. Not where I went, not what I wore, not what time it was, but the feeling of re-entering my body after years of abandoning it. The diary deepened. When I got home, he asked if everything was okay. I said yes. And for the first time, it wasn't a lie. That line made my eyes sting. Because it was the first honest yes I had spoken in years, even if he didn't understand why. I kept reading. The next page held a realization. Maybe healing isn't loud. Maybe it doesn't come with declarations or dramatic choices. Maybe healing begins quietly, in the smallest decisions a woman makes for herself. That entry felt like a hand on my shoulder, gentle, grounding, because healing rarely arrives in grand gestures. It arrives in sips of tea, in quiet walks, in allowing yourself to breathe without apology. I turned to the next entry. This one was written with steadier handwriting, still delicate, but firmer. I listened to myself today, not the guilt, not the expectation, not the fear, just myself. And for a moment, I heard something I haven't heard in years, my own thoughts unfiltered. I paused, your own thoughts. Without the noise of doctrine, pressure, or perfection, that is the first true freedom. The diary continued. I realized I've spent so long trying to be worthy of everyone else that I never learned how to be worthy to myself. That line pierced me. Because it's the truth behind every quiet heartbreak a woman carries when she's been shaped to serve rather than exist. I turned another page. This entry felt almost like a whisper. Today I looked in the mirror and didn't look away. Simple, but monumental. Because for years, mirrors were places of judgment, reminders of inadequacy, imperfection, and the endless list of who I wasn't. But that day, I looked and stayed. I didn't love what I saw, the entry continued, but I recognized her. And that recognition felt like the beginning of something. Recognition. The first step toward returning to yourself. I kept reading. I'm not better. I'm not healed. I'm not sure of anything. But I'm beginning to understand that disappearing was never my purpose. I was never meant to fade. I exhaled slowly. Because that truth, that she wasn't meant to fade, is the moment the story begins to breathe. The entry ended with a line that broke me open in the softest way. Maybe I'm allowed to exist. I closed my eyes. Yes, she always was. And the diary, this secret map of my lost self, was now guiding me back. Not quickly, not dramatically, but step by quiet step. A reawakening, a return, a beginning. The next page was empty. A blank space. And somehow, that empty page felt like hope. The empty page in the diary felt like a breath I didn't know I had been holding. A blank space. Unwritten, unclaimed, waiting. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. It didn't feel like freedom or courage or rebirth. It felt simpler than that, like a pause after a long, trembling sentence that I wasn't sure how to finish. I turned the page again. Another blank space. My younger self had stopped writing for a while. And strangely, that silence didn't feel like the heavy silence that had defined so much of my life. It felt different. Like the beginning of a new kind of quiet. The kind that comes when you no longer need to hide from yourself. Eventually, I found the next entry. The handwriting was calmer, more deliberate, less desperate. I'm trying to learn myself, slowly, gently, without judgment. That line softened something inside me. Because learning yourself is not loud work, it's not linear, it's not pretty. It's not easy, but it's real. The entry continued. I ask myself today what I truly enjoy. The question felt strange. I didn't know the answer, but instead of feeling ashamed, I felt curious. Curiosity, a small, quiet spark, the opposite of fear. I sat outside and listened to the wind again. And I realized something, that I don't need permission to feel alive. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. Not sadness. Recognition. Because that truth, that life does not require permission, is the kind of realization that doesn't change everything at once. But it changes the direction of everything. I turned the page, another entry. He asked if I wanted to talk about anything. I said no, not because I wanted to hide, but because I'm not ready to speak the things I'm just beginning to understand. I smiled faintly. Honesty doesn't always come in words first. Sometimes it begins in the quiet allowance to feel. The diary deepened. I'm not angry. I'm not resentful. I'm not thinking about leaving. I just want to know myself. And for the first time, that doesn't feel like a sin. That line, that quiet permission, felt like a small miracle. I kept reading. I walked past the mirror again today. I didn't avoid it. I didn't look away quickly. I just looked. And instead of seeing someone failing, I saw someone trying. Trying. Trying is sacred. Trying is brave. Trying is a kind of healing on its own. The next entry was small, almost hesitant. I think there is a part of me that survived all the silence. I closed my eyes. Because survival doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like a single ember refusing to die. I turned the final page, the last entry in the diary. There were only 3 lines, simple, soft, true. I'm not who they wanted me to be. I'm not who I used to be. But maybe, finally, I'm becoming someone. I felt the weight of everything settle in my chest, not heavy, but grounding. Because that was the ending my younger self needed. Not a grand escape, not a proclamation, not a sudden transformation. Just becoming quietly, honestly, in her own time. I closed the diary slowly, my fingers lingering on the worn cover. For years, I thought this book held my shame, my doubts, my brokenness. But now, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like proof that I had been alive, even in the moments I thought I was disappearing. Proof that even at my lowest, some small part of me refused to give up. Refused to surrender. Refused to stay silent forever. And now, sitting here as the woman I've become, I whispered something I wish she could have heard. You made it. Quietly, but you made it. I didn't burn the diary. I didn't hide it again. I didn't rewrite the past. I simply placed it back in its box, not as a memory to bury, but as a reminder of the girl I was, the woman I lost, and the person I'm still becoming. My life isn't perfect. My answers aren't complete. My voice is still soft, sometimes unsure. But it's mine now, and for the first time in my life, that is enough.